What we're going to be doing with this webinar is looking at actually quite a few things. We'll be exploring some recent surveys, and there's actually been a whole bunch of surveys that surveyed students in what their perceptions were of remote teaching, remote learning, what it was like. And some of you may have attended the webinar I did this past summer and early fall on this topic. So much has changed since then that I decided to take some of that information and update it with a lot of the new findings that are out there. And I think there's some really interesting trends and some things that I think us as instructors really need to kind of digest and think about as to how we want to move forward with online teaching, and whether it is the panacea, which we know it's not, but there's a lot of talk about whether this is going to continue with more online instruction or not. So this is a conversation that we need to start having. I know that others are having that. What I will also we'll be talking about are some common themes, some pervasiveness of these challenges that these surveys have found. I'm also providing y'all with some feedback from my own students, some anecdotal comments, and then just really what overall all these things, all these perspectives are saying with respect to what students want in our online courses, what they need from us as instructors. Let me go ahead and show you some of these recent surveys that I will be discussing here. So one of them was this past summer by Digital Promise, where they had a survey of student perceptions of that remote shift to online teaching. Another one was Ithaka Sr. Basically the survey group that they surveyed student experiences during the pandemic. Top Hat did one in October of 2020. And then there is a website that is interesting. It's not all of the surveys of most recent, it's more of the COVID survey, so the effect of moving online due to COVID. And there's a bunch of surveys out there. So if this is something you're interested in, looking at who's doing the survey, what groups, what the questions were, whether it's institutional versus student, this might be a neat website for you to explore if this is something you're interested in. But it is the most recent one, I believe, was up here. I believe, oh, where did it go? Sorry, I'm scrolling and y'all are watching that. September, that's what it was, Top Hat, September. So with that being said, and so Kim says students in a program that is typically online is still a different vibe. That's true. Students were feeling socially disconnected. We're looking for more social connection than they usually need. And that's a really good point, that students who expect the course to be fully online already know what the expectations are versus students who are thrown into a course online. And I think that's an important distinction to keep in mind, and one that many articles online talk about, that when you're an online student, there are things you need to know about how to be an online student. But when you're thrown there because of a pandemic, you don't know these things. You don't come in with this background knowledge of how to learn, and it is a very different environment. So one of the things that happened, so this research from Digital Promise, this survey, was about the pivot, the remote rapid pivot in March from face-to-face to online. And so some of the findings that they found there were what the classrooms were like. And I show this because of something I want to ask you guys. But first of all, look at what the course features were like after moving online, and this is in March. There were live sessions. So there were some live sessions, 67% of students said there were. Recorded lectures, frequent quizzes, live lectures, pre-recorded video, and breakout groups. So let me ask you, has your course changed significantly now compared to what it was last spring? Or have you done a lot, and I'm sure we all have done as much work as we can. How much has it changed? Has it changed the way you wanted it to a more facilitated, engaged online course compared to what it was in spring of 2020? And that's going to look very different for every discipline. I think what we found, or what I found, was what I wanted it to do and how I wanted it to be was harder than I thought it was going to be. And so it's something that you get better with as you go. But that's something you want to think about is when we had this rapid pivot where I just tried to get things going and make sure that students got something, is my course different from what it was back in March 2020? Yeah, and I think those of you who have taught online have more so than others have learned what the good practices are, and you are able to implement those better. And those of us who have not are learning those as we go and making modifications as we go. Yes, so making assignments more frequent, do more frequently to try and keep them more engaged, creating more quizzes, being able to drop some. I think what you want to think about is, did I make changes that were good, were positive in my course relative to what I did in March 2020, if you hadn't had much experience with teaching online. And I know that's something that I've had to really remind myself to think about. What I did in March was just keeping my head above water. So how can I improve my course now to address these issues that we're going to talk about with respect to students and what they need from us as instructors, okay? So where the online course became worse, and again, this was in spring of 2020, is that, and so the blues, the dark blues, are where students' experiences were worse after the shift to online instruction. And what you can see is that where it was about 42 to 50% availability of help, feelings of being included, engagement and keeping you interested in course content, 57%, opportunities to collaborate. And so these got worse with the spring shift to online. And so what I want y'all to take away from this is these are where we need to make sure we focus our continually upgrading and improving our courses to make sure that these don't happen in well-designed online courses. And of course, well-designed courses typically address these situations and these issues anyway. But what you can see is that a lot of it is help with students, interaction with students. Yeah, I like that idea, a daily to-do list. That's a really great idea. Feelings of being included as a community, that is a very important aspect of having a positive online experience. Some of the greatest challenges with remote learning, and some of y'all have already mentioned these, which is wonderful, is students really were having difficulty staying motivated without routine, without a regular class routine of going to class, sitting in class, getting things done, you know, going to the library at 7 o'clock, meeting friends, getting work done. And that routine, that college experience routine, was missing. And I like to, when I've been thinking about this presentation, I often was thinking back on what my college experience was like. And I just remember the experience of being in college, going and doing college things with other college students. And our students have missed that. Especially, there was a really interesting finding from one of the surveys that freshmen actually are having, within, you know, variation, an easier time of coming into class and being online remote because they don't know anything different compared to our sophomores and our juniors and our seniors. And so having the ability to stay motivated, knowing what to do, how to keep yourself motivated with a very different environment from what you're used to learning, that's very difficult for students. All these distractions around the house, you know, my dog is laying here snoring, that's a distraction. All these different things, you know, that students have going on. And so missing the presence of the instructor. This was a really big finding throughout the summer surveys and into the fall, that environment of learning where you go into a class, you sit down, you talk to other students, whether it's chatting, whether it's asking questions, whether it's just that back and forth interaction between the professor and the students, is missing. And it's hard to duplicate that in online courses. You can if you're good at it and if you really have a good rapport with your students. But yes, and so students had all those the family responsibilities that really detracted from their learning. But when students are in a class and have developed that community and that camaraderie, research shows that improves student engagement, improves their motivation, improves their what they get out of the course improves the retention of students in the class itself. So being able to have that community where you can see everybody, interact with people is a big issue. And it's something that as instructors, we need to think about how we can address in our courses if we use, say, Blackboard Collaborate and we don't have the screen of 20 to 30 faces or avatars, whatever it might be. And then also the loss of hands-on experiences, especially for STEM and engineering and hard sciences, and just really any of the courses where you go and do things and you do activities and you apply it in certain situations, and working with others to do that, that is key to learning. And so sometimes the online courses, the move to online, either dropped that or wasn't able to facilitate that as as authentically as you would have been able to do in person. And so all of these were things that were challenges with just and I say remote learning, but online learning in general. These are things you need to think about with respect to how you design your classes and online, and how you continue to keep your students motivated through the online learning experience. So you can see here minor problems, major problems for students finding quiet places, having family responsibilities. There's a lot, 40%, 55%, staying motivated, 79%. That's a large percentage of students having these problems with their online courses, and it's consistent through all of these surveys. Now, I do want to just briefly touch on the fact that the Digital Promise, and this is the only one I've seen that actually looked at differences with diversity and inclusivity, and what they found was specifically with online learning, Hispanic students had greater number of challenges, and they found that it was related to the household income. And I know that we've all seen similar situations with all of our students, the availability of internet services, of computing, technology just being available. There is a noticeable statistical decrease in students being able to do courses online well based on basic household issues and social issues. So I think that's something, going back to the problems with ethnicity and race, that what they were experiencing, you need to keep that in mind as well, finding out from your students, does everyone have access to these? Don't ask that question in the middle of class, but send out an email, send out a poll, finding out what students do and don't need. And I think a lot of y'all, a lot of instructors did that, especially in spring, but also in fall. So specifically, what the students experienced, kind of to summarize what we talked about, is that the course where students really suffered after moving to online instruction was where there was a lack of feedback from the instructors. There were some examples that the instructors put everything, and I'm not talking about here, I'm talking about from all the surveys, some anecdotes of instructors putting everything online, asynchronous, and then the only time that they actually got anything from the professor was when the exams were sent out. Through the rest of the semester, I'm just like, oh my God, that's awful. Opportunities to collaborate and get feedback from their peers. As much as you think that, oh, the students who are online can chat in the chat log, they don't, unless you really push for them to chat or to develop that environment and that community for them to do so. They're just, students are reticent to do those types of things. So it's difficult to get them to be engaged in that way. And then, as we already talked about, motivation and interest increased, or it was worse online. Lack of feedback was worse online. Yeah, and turning on the cameras. Feelings of inclusion was worse online. And yes, a lot of it has to do with the motivation of the students, but that comes from the environment and the atmosphere that you create as the professor and in the class itself. So, how can I make sure that that environment is conducive to students wanting to participate? And a lot of it comes with just being comfortable with the class itself. It gets better every week, essentially. And as I already mentioned, internet software devices, 25 to 30% of students had a serious enough problem with this that it impeded their participation. That's a lot. You know, if you have 10 students, that's 3 of them. That's a lot of students, or 2 of them, okay? So another report that I thought was really interesting was this Ithaka SR, and this again was spring 2020, and it said many of the similar things. This was how easy or difficult have each of the following been for you? Balancing all the responsibilities, time management, those were the top 2. Adjusting to online instruction, balancing work and school responsibilities, getting help, childcare, having reliable access. And so really what came to the surface of these surveys was that connection, the lack of connection, the lack of the sense of belonging, how to balance things, how to motivate yourself, how to get used to working online. And several of y'all mentioned this earlier about working online and having online courses is very different. And for students, and as I mentioned as well, for students who have not had that experience, they don't know how to manage and budget their time and manage their just self-efficacy, essentially. So collaborative, technical, specialized assignments were very difficult. One of the, I think, well, in my opinion, one of the hardest things about moving online for sciences is you don't get to do the stuff you want to do in labs. And so it's hard to get a sense of how to, for this week we're doing rocks, how to visualize what you're looking at a rock when all you're looking at is a picture. So the students don't get that, you know, that really tactile experience with working with rocks and minerals, which is the fun part of geology, and so that will affect retention down the line. And so they're really missing a lot of the part of the learning that is important in the class with the professor and students that's lacking in this online content. And then, of course, as y'all have already mentioned, physical and mental health issues. A huge amount of students are dealing with this. It's a real problem. And even food and housing security was an issue, and is still probably an issue for many students. So lots of issues that have come up have surfaced in this new scenario that we're having to deal with. So Top Hat did a survey in October 2020 that was very in-depth. I thought it was really interesting. And they surveyed 3,400 undergraduates throughout the basically US and Canada. And so they asked these questions of these students. And so one of the questions was, or statements was, the online learning experience is engaging inside the classroom. The students were asked to how strongly they agreed or disagreed. And so disagree and strongly disagree, 53% is not engaging the online learning experience. The online learning experience is engaging outside the classroom. And this has to do with the activities that they do outside the classroom, the homework, the assessments, whatever it might be. They're saying that what they're being asked to do is busy work. And I think that was something that came through a lot of the surveys, is that students were seeing, and whether this was the case or not, students were thinking that all these assignments they were being asked to do was busy work, even though to the instructor they were not, that there was a purpose to them. The students were still seeing it that way, and I thought that was interesting. And then I am able to stay motivated and engaged with my education and coursework outside of class time. 40, was that 30, 40, 53% basically said no, that they are not able to stay motivated outside of class time. And that then brings into the issue of everything else that's pulling on their attention and their needs and what they have to take care of outside of class. It's really impacting their learning as an online environment, in an online environment. Okay, so the other question, another question of many, was, do you think you're learning as effectively online as you would have in person? And look at that, the pink. No. So they're saying, students are saying that online is ineffective at most, especially when you compare it to in-person classes. And we would all say the same thing, that we get more out of teaching when we teach in person. Yes, everybody go watch YouTube tutorials or Khan Academy. There was a comment in one survey about a student saying he learned more by going and watching Khan Academy tutorials than from the actual video lectures that his professor posted. And I was like, oh, wow, you know, that's just, yes, exactly. That's what I said too. So they're not thinking that what they're getting out of their classes is worthwhile and it's ineffective. And I'm going to show you a quote from one of my students about his perspective of, is it worth paying money to come to class or come to the university when this is the situation that they're experiencing? And then one of the questions with Top Hat was, have you experienced any difficulties in adjusting to online learning? And so basically, yes. What they're seeing as well, and I thought this was really interesting, was that in classes where there were more online tools to help learning, 4 or more, the students had more difficulties keeping up with the material, didn't have as much interaction and engagement because they were trying to navigate all these tools. So it was a poorer learning experience. And so that makes me consider, you know, if I use Patback or if I use Blackboard or if I use, you know, clickers, and how many of those things do I use? Is it all detracting from each other because there are so many? And I know us here at University of South Carolina, there are so many platforms that are being used in different disciplines and colleges and schools that it's contributing, I think, to that overwhelming, just they're feeling completely overwhelmed with having to deal with the technology and also learn at the same time. And so something has to give, and what gives is the learning, unfortunately. So they're having more difficulty in navigating more resources, and when that happens, the students who are having that problem are saying that the synchronous learning is not engaging. They have less positive reaction to their classes when there are more tools being used. And also when they are more tools, they have less interaction with their peers and their instructor, because what seems to happen is that if there's more tools, then there's more opportunities to engage with other people, but that actually doesn't happen. They get overwhelmed. Yes, absolutely, get overwhelmed by all these different platforms and tools to use. So I thought that was a really interesting finding and really made me rethink, how many am I actually using? You know, which ones are actually beneficial to my students and worthwhile keeping compared to others. There was one other, 2 more. So there was one that was a very informal questionnaire put out by Norman Eng. He asked his students, and this kind of just reiterates what we were talking about, what were the challenges that they had, and it was organizing, keeping track of everything. So one of y'all mentioned this, where students had a hard time keeping track of everything that's due in every class. And normally that's something that when you're in class, you have those reminders. It's, for whatever reason, it's easier to keep track of, but when everything's online on your computer, things get lost in the shuffle. And I know I have the same problem myself. Therefore, that's why I have lists on paper, not on the computer, because of that same issue. Students have the same issue. And so the amount of content that's being sent out and communicated by, you know, if they have 5 classes or 4 classes, it's just complete cognitive overload for students who are not used to knowing how to manage this type of thing. If they've never been online in a course, even if they've only been online in a couple semesters, it still takes time. It's a skill to develop on how to manage this type of communication that's coming at them. So when they needed this informal question, ask them, what do you need from me, from your instructors? And that what they want is a routine. They want a routine, and this is something I've always done in my classes, where I have a housekeeping, what I literally call housekeeping slide, where everything is on the very first slide that I introduce the class. These are the things coming up. This is something you need to be doing. Remember this due date. And I've had a question or two where people ask, yes, you do have to over-organize because the students have so much going on. They are missing that. They're not able to do that. And I've had the question of, well, aren't you just, you know, hand-holding for them? And my response is, why not? I already know what needs to be done. That's a slide that took a minute to type up, and it will be extremely beneficial for students for them to keep up. I have no problem doing that. So I think that it is extremely useful to have those types of things to help them keep track and have that daily to-do list or that weekly to-do list. They need that. They want that because they don't know where to start if they're trying to do that themselves. Yes, definitely. So keep sending reminders, and then having flexibility and understanding. And I'm going to show you some comments of some of my students in a little bit about this past fall, where that really came out. They were like, thank you for being so flexible, and some of y'all are going to say no in deadlines, in allowing when you would accept certain things or not caring, but not being concerned if they were turned in, a couple days, a week late. As long as they got turned in and it was done, they still did the learning that you wanted them to do. And students appreciated that, especially when they were trying to learn how to manage everything. And then reasonable workloads. And I'll mention this briefly in just a little bit, that classes online and instructors who are moving their classes online seem to the instructors aren't necessarily, well, some of them may be giving students more work because they think the students have more time, which is not necessarily the case. But students also, their perception is that might be more work because you as the instructor are trying to help them manage the assignments that they're doing by breaking them up into smaller assignments, which you're not actually making more work, but to them it feels that way. And so that's kind of that disconnect there. And so one way to solve that is to say, look, this is how I'm going to give you this assignment. It is not any more work than if it were to be done in person, online, as a big group final paper, whatever. What I'm doing is helping to motivate you and encourage you and prompt you to do things to keep up with the tasks and to keep on track. And that's something I've started doing with some of my larger projects, is having due dates for specific things where they have to have something done by this date and done by this date to help keep them on time. And then there was this one class survey which basically said 85% of the conditions with the pandemic negatively affected their academic performance. That's a lot. That's a lot of students saying, 85% of the students saying the conditions with the pandemic and with the whole society and political upheaval in general affected negatively their performances. And so one thing that I kind of pulled from a lot of this was that, when you're remote teaching, students are remote learning, it's all remote. You're missing all the key cues that you need, the key reminders, the social aspects and social reminders, and so that really is detrimental to students' academic performance, especially in a college environment. And I think that, for graduate students, it's very much more set by either your advisor or your own timeline. Undergraduates, it's not. It's set by the university experience in the university, just the way that the university flows through each semester, essentially. So basically, they're learning challenging coursework under very, very suboptimal conditions. And so hoping that they just get as much, you want them to have the best learning experience, but at this point, we're like, I just want them to keep their head above water. That's what they're wanting, is just to be able to survive the semester. And that's not what we wanted at all, unfortunately. And we've already talked about the mental health issues, family responsibilities, loneliness and anxiety, and chronic stress. And as I mentioned before, this loss of this typical college experience that we all experienced, and so many students are not. It's just a very different perspective that they're coming from. So just a couple more additional findings. As I've already mentioned, students are overwhelmed by the technology. The more there is, the worse they are at managing engagement. That idea, as I mentioned already, of the greater workload, feeling overwhelmed, that really what it is from our perspective is the different distribution, but they don't know that. And so that goes to the idea that I always reiterate to be transparent with your students and say, hey, this is how I'm doing this. This is why I'm separating this out. Know that I'm not giving you more work. I'm helping you manage your workload, and that will go a long way. And I'm sure y'all are finding that the students are having difficulty with self-regulation, keeping up, having personal discipline. Several of these surveys have talked about students not knowing how to motivate themselves or keep themselves on task or on track. And so that's kind of part of the university learning experience, is that we learn how to do that. They're now learning how to do that with the pandemic, with political upheaval, with online learning. And so it's just compounding their missing how to do that very important social and personal skill. Lack of, as I already mentioned, the visual and auditory feedback from the audience, which is their students, their colleagues, from you in a classroom. And so they're just having a harder time learning online. And as a result, their grades are suffering. Let's see, something else that really came out was that students who, if there was an activity or an assessment that did not get a grade, there was no grade incentive, whether it was in class or out of class, students stopped doing them. The survey said was deprioritize these activities. So they just quit doing them because there was no reason to do them. And then this tied into whether or not they even came to class for the synchronous classes, doing any of the out of class work, coming to the synchronous classes and doing breakout sessions. They wouldn't do the work to come in because they were able to hang on the coattails basically of other students, because other students would. And so you're seeing an exacerbation of what you may have had in face-to-face classes, even worse online, because these activities you're asking them to do, which you hope will be, growth experiences and learning and active learning experiences, there's no incentive to do them, to motivate them to be done. And this also gets to the idea where there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the fully asynchronous classes, because there's no interaction, there's no motivation to have things ready and done for class time. All they do is they wait till the exam, cram, and then they're done. And so that's not a good learning environment. This was something else. This was a good quote that I saw, where students are, so much is being done online that it's taxing. It's taxing for us as instructors, for our students as well. They thought with online classes everything would be easier, but they felt like it's the same amount of work but with less motivation and encouragement from professors. I thought that was really interesting. So we need to up our motivation for even things that seem like smaller tasks for them. It's really important to realize that the retention, all of the surveys showed, the more an instructor developed community with their students, got to know their students, increased student retention and increased student learning in their classes. The better the opportunity for their students to communicate with you, the students are more motivated to be active and engaged in class. The way I do this is I have a class group me. And for the two classes that I teach this semester, one is 24 students, another is 32 students. I told them it's the requirement, you have to be in GroupMe, and I said this is how I communicate with you guys. It's easier for me to throw in a chat. I even use abbreviations and stuff, and it keeps them. I've developed a really good community with my classes. They then talk back and forth to each other. They remind each other, hey, we don't have class today. Remember, it's online today. Hey, whatever. And that has really helped to increase the community of this class that I'm teaching, that is both face-to-face as well as a synchronous live stream. Here's another good quote. Students really missed being in person with classmates, with the faculty, having spontaneous, organic conversations. They miss these relationships that they make in the context of their college education, because it makes them excited, holds them accountable, motivates them, and they learn more. So this whole community, I think, is just, if you take one nugget away, this is it, is developing that community to help provide stability to them for their learning. So they always know they come to class, it's a stable learning environment, this is what they expect, this is what they will experience. All of this is really helpful for your students. So I want to show you a couple of responses from my students. I'm just going to touch on what was said. But this one student is a senior from School of Business. He said there's a weak incentive to attend any kind of non-in-person class, results in worse performances from students. The priority should be for students to get back into classroom. The participation is more difficult and really discourages students from even engaging in case specifically because the professor might not hear you, might not see your question, might skip over your question, so many little things like that. And he also said that the online classes are a net negative due to the loss of the spirit of the classroom that makes the college worthwhile. This is a student that texted this to me yesterday, and it just reinforces everything we're hearing in our surveys. And he even said online learning is not even remotely worth tuition, which we all know how much more work goes into online courses. But to them, they don't see it that way. And so they're going to see enrollment decreases if this continues, which, you know, it's a really good point. A freshman, she said, I felt like I lacked all contact with my teacher, wasn't able to build a relationship. I'm very socially motivated, to not even be able to even speak to my teacher made me less motivated in the class. And these are good students. Synchronous classes actually went better than I expected and wasn't that much different. So she really liked those. And then with online classes, I've noticed that my teachers give a lot more assignments than my in-person classes. Whether that is actually the case or goes back to that splitting up the assignments so to help them, she doesn't realize that because she doesn't know what the class is supposed to be like. So it's something to keep in mind. So going back to the best practices, what came through all of these, and this is something that the earlier surveys really touched on, and it just kept proving itself over and over, was these kind of recommended, and again, we call them best practices, but really good things you should be doing as an instruction online as well as in person. But assignments that students actually have to do something with and get something for, as well as having them be responsible for turning something in and getting points for it. One thing I tell my students is I am not going to ask you to do something that I don't think is important for you to learn how to do. I'm not going to assign you busy work. If it's considered busy work, it's wasting your time. It's wasting my time. We don't have time to waste. So I'm not going to do that. And if you feel that an assignment is that way, tell me and let me explain to you why I'm having you do this. But it also has really helped me winnow out some of the busy work that I did used to assign in the past. That just, there's no reason for it. Breaking up class activities into shorter pieces, frequent quizzes and assessments that are worth something. There's incentive. Live sessions where students can interact and participate. And again, I know there's problems managing these sorts of things, but these are what the students are needing. Here it said meeting in breakout groups. That has changed. So from the spring 2020 to now, students are not liking breakout groups because they're finding that the better students are having to pull the weight of the other students. So what they're finding now is having some kind of content or material or product that they come away with every breakout group session, whether it's and I have like formatted slides that you can use where students fill in the slides, and then students take turns of who's responsible for writing things down, generating different aspects of it. That is important to do with breakout groups, not just go discuss, because that never happens. The personal messages, the connection with the professor. How are you doing? How are you feeling? Are you able to access the materials? Again, real world examples, connection to why they need to know this, that this is not busy work. This is why you need to do this, be able to do this. Those were the main best practices. And most impactful of all of these through this digital promise survey, and then everything else has been supporting this, is that connection with the instructor. Connection with the instructor of how you're doing, the support, the encouragement, even things like that daily list of things to do is a personal connection from the instructor. And students see it that way as your way of getting them connected to you in the class. Using their first names, absolutely. Just recognizing them and saying hi when they walk into or join the classroom, whatever it is. The feedback, again, is really important. There were some comments where Students complained that they would turn in all these things online and it would never get graded. There would never be feedback. Matter of fact, it wouldn't get graded till the end of the semester, so they didn't even know how they were doing. And that shows, that points to faculty being overwhelmed, but also perhaps faculty not taking that online content and assignments seriously. The discussion boards, they didn't like them. They didn't like, so there was a lot about students not liking discussion boards because it was making them be having to actually read the materials and post things, but also that there wasn't good interaction, that it was this requirement that they had to check off, but there was actually no real learning. And so I think that goes to, are your discussion questions, not just have a post and do a post, but are you actually generating conversations? And I think there's different aspects that you can do to encourage the conversations. Using the real world examples, why do I need to know this? Why do I care about this? Why am I learning this when something else might be more important? Well, no, this is why. Be, again, that transparency as to why you're having students do certain things. Expressing what they learned, that reflection on the value add that they're getting from these assignments is really important. Incentivizing their participation. I know a lot of people don't like to award points for participation because it varies, but there are different ways to quantify participation for different types of students. And there's a lot online about how to do that online in synchronous and in asynchronous courses. The clear prompt communication, we've been talking about that, letting them know what they need to do, keeping on, not harping on them, but say, this is coming up next week, don't forget. And then that motivation. They don't know how to self-motivate. I still lack that myself sometimes. I'm like, weekend, I just want to sleep. I don't want to do anything, which is fine, self-care. But realize that it takes so much longer for students to do things online, to learn how to do things online, to read online, to write online, that it's just a very different way of learning. And so then they're having that be compounded with what's going on in their environment, their home, outside, that it's just so many things just contributing to a more negative experience than we expected or we had any idea. And then, as I've said before, enhancing that connection and collaboration, making sure the students make the connections between each other. I've seen a couple of things on academic Twitter about professors, instructors online asking a question at the beginning of every class. An easy question: what's your favorite food? What's your favorite color? Where have you visited? Where students just start these conversations. Oh, I've been there before. That was a really cool place. Or have you tried this restaurant? Where they're really starting to develop this community. And that's something you do before class starts, but students will join earlier in order to participate in those conversations. Yeah, would you rather? That's a really good one. Absolutely. Two truths and a lie. Those types of things are a lot of fun. So those types of things really help with that collaborative community that is shown to be almost the most important thing that you can do for your online classes. And then just to show you those best practices, students who had classes where they had 0 to 2 of those best practices, 43% satisfaction. 3 to 5, 61%. 6 to 8, so many of those best practices, 74% had a very satisfied or satisfied what they thought about that online course. So that personal contact, that individual connection, activities that are worthwhile and mean something, all of it ties together to a better environment online for your students. So let me ask you, as kind of the final wrap up, what do you think that you can change in your classes to address any one of these issues, something that you're not doing yet that now you know you want to do and you can do? So go ahead and post that in the chat right now. Get rid of busy work, absolutely. Relate their learning outcomes, yep, directly to the assignments. Silly polls are always good. Individual emails. Let's see, informal chat, yes. Time before and after class, yeah. And so, yes, I think even online, just saying, hey, I'm gonna stay here for the next 10 minutes. Y'all stay and chat with me if you have questions. Absolutely. Purpose, yeah, Kahoot's great, absolutely. So the last thing I wanted to show you is there's a couple of really good resources about online instructor presence. This website, instructorpresence.com, is kind of a tutorial for how you as an instructor can develop your presence. It's a really, really good resource. Jim Lang just came out with a book on about distracted students. Why are they distracted? How can we deal with that? Just other articles. Zoom fatigue. There actually is research out there on why Zoom fatigue is a real thing. And it was a really interesting discussion about you're lacking just that disconnect between when someone says something and then the response that actually has a negative feedback loop in your brain itself. I thought it was really interesting. And then pedagogy of kindness. This was a really neat article.